So, Michael, you have written this very timely book about your own career as an organizer called The Hard Work of Hope. And nothing is more important in this precarious time for American democracy than a lot of organizing. Let me start by asking you um, what some of the differences are between the eras that you describe in your own career organizing against the Vietnam War, and later on as a community organizer and the head of Massachusetts Fair Share in the late 70s and early 80s. Uh, what was possible and what was challenging in those eras, and what lessons from what you learned in those eras do you draw for people who are trying to get organizing done in this even more challenging era?
That's a huge question, Bob. Let me try and answer it as concisely as I can.
Well,
So,
unpack it. Don't
okay,
don't
so
beat it,
I,
guys.
I, I mean the primary difference is that when I was young doing organizing and activism, we were protesting, organizing against a liberal consensus and liberals in power. So you think about the anti-Vietnam War effort that started under Johnson, and the sort of politics that we'd known had been the politics of the Kennedy Johnson era. Now we're in a very, very different world in which the federal government is controlled by fascists. I think there's no other word to describe them accurately, willing to break any boundary, trample the Constitution, and um, there's almost no red line that they won't cross. So that's one huge difference. Another, when I was young, uh, young people were in a very different position than young people today. We didn't worry about a job. We worried about, could we get a meaningful job? What would constitute a meaningful job? I emerged as a scholarship student from Harvard with significantly less than $3,000 in debt. And that's dramatically different than young people today. And I never worried about, could I rent an apartment and could I buy a house? Whereas young people today are constantly worrying about that. So I think there are significant differences in the political environment. The other thing I would say is both the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement started and for a long time was really a prophetic minority, and we were trying to convince people that the causes were right. And when we started organizing against the war, 90+% of the country and every political leader, every church leader, every university president, every newspaper editor supported that war. Today, we're in a very different situation in which a majority of the population opposes what MAGA is doing, but it doesn't always show up, it doesn't always vote, and it isn't really well organized. In terms of lessons, there's so many. I mean, there are the obvious ones from the mistakes that I made as a youth. Symbolism matters. I ended up in 1969 and 1970 marching under NLF flags. And now, of course, I look back and I wish I only marched under American flags and we didn't chant "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh's going to win." We should have been singing "America the Beautiful." Symbolism matters. The other obvious lesson is that nonviolence is essential. And I would say more than ever, I believe that the Trump regime is looking for the excuse to clamp down even more. And so it is imperative that we stick to nonviolence and that we claim the moral high ground.
Just to weigh in on the 1969, 1970 era that I was also involved in. I mean, two really big ironies. So, first of all, and I remember this vividly because I was part of it, you were organizing anti-war efforts as a radical. And it took about 2 or 3 years before the radicals persuaded the liberals to be against the war. I remember a Jules Feiffer cartoon from 1967 depicting a queasy liberal with a sign that says a little less bombing. And a little less bombing didn't do it. On the other hand, by 69 and 70, the liberals had become more influential in the anti-war movement than the radicals, and the liberals were trying to persuade the radicals, as you indicated, not to be for Ho Chi Minh and not to be for the National Liberation Front, but to try and assemble the broadest possible coalition against the war. And I think to some extent, the liberals succeeded in doing that, guys like Sam Brown, etc. And yet the other irony is that Ho Chi Minh did win, and the NLF did win. And now the NLF, or the Vietnamese government, is doing trade deals with Donald Trump. So it's just bizarre the way history unfolds. And I think to come back to the main point of this conversation, we talked before we went on, and I think we both agree that there's going to be a conflict between how much we can turn mobilization into electoral organizing versus how fast the Trump administration can destroy the right to vote and to have every vote counted. So each day brings new headlines about the Trumpified federal government trying to intrude on the right of state and local governments to conduct elections, most recently with the Justice Department demanding information on voting machines and demanding information on voting rolls, and the Supreme Court backing Trump's claim that he can order people to show proof of citizenship and a lot of other bad stuff. So, what's your view? Handicap this race between more organizing on the one hand, higher turnout, all the things that progressives always do, versus the intensified efforts at voter suppression.
So I think we don't have a full picture yet of what Trump will try and do to put, his thumb on the scale in 26. But I think we know he will continue to find ways to do that. And there's some shocking ideas that I'm sure they're thinking about. One would be, all right, let's occupy major centers of Democratic voters with the National Guard and maybe the Marines and see if we can intimidate them. Another crazy one would be, the Congress and Speaker Johnson says God is telling me that these people who were just elected are illegitimate, and so we're not going to recognize them, and we're not going to seat a new Congress. I don't know that those are out of the question, but here's what I know: the only path for us is to organize so deeply and so broadly that we turn out a massive number of voters in the 26th election, despite whatever suppression, and we win the House, and if at all possible, win the Senate. The Senate is going to be much harder, but I don't think it is totally out of the question. And then we also have to do that in a way that builds organization, that doesn't just mobilize and doesn't view elections as marketing exercises, but as an attempt to organize people into organizations. As our mutual friend Richie Rothstein told me decades ago, organizers organize organizations. And that's the difference between organizing and mobilizing. I would have to say, I think we're doing reasonably well on the mobilizing scale right now. I think that's happening and is going to continue to happen. I'm very worried that not enough organizing. We have a host of issues. You just wrote something about student loans. We could be organizing young people about student debt and student loans. We could be organizing veterans about what's happening in the VA. We could be organizing rural people about the fact that may only happen until right after the midterms, but they're going to lose their rural hospitals and their health care is going to cost a whole lot more, if not being out of reach entirely. So the question I think confronting progressives, the left, and liberals is how much organizing can we do in these months? And you're right, we're in a race with Trump and the Trump regime. And right now, our organizing isn't keeping pace, but I have hope that it will. I do see more and more signs that organizing is happening.
So an awful lot has been written about Zoran Mamdani,
Mhm.
and some of it is drivel, some of it is interesting. Um, and I think what we have here is a convergence of an incredibly charismatic, likable guy uh, with a message that is very mainstream. People can't afford to live, who also has invented or improved upon techniques in a way that other people hadn't done. And it's interesting to see who draws what kinds of lessons from Mamdani's success. For instance, um, he used video in a very creative way that portrayed him walking around New York City and talking to ordinary people um, in a way that was charming and also very revealing of what was on people's minds and illustrative of his ability to connect with regular people. My favorite one was the conversations with the halal guys.
Right.
Now what you have is fairly conventional politicians trying to bottle this, and Mario Cuomo walking around in shirt sleeves with the iconic Greek themed New York coffee cup, and you have people who did very stale kind of voter contacts, trying to figure out, oh, we need to be doing video. And of course, without the messaging and without the really compelling candidate, uh, technique by itself doesn't do it. Um, what what do you think other candidates ought to be learning from Mamdani? And to kind of complicate the question, which uses of digital um, are kind of trite and silly, and which uses of social media organizing ought we to be emphasizing?
So let's talk about that campaign. I think everything you said is true, but there are other factors that were really significant. So, great candidate, probably one of the best politicians to emerge in the recent years. Charismatic, accessible, authentic. Great message, cost of living, need for change. So, a charismatic change candidate who talked about the cost of living. Does that remind you of anybody? But he was much more authentic in his doing, and he had a real program, and he wasn't lying. But then there are some other factors. Okay, creative use of social media. But here are two factors that aren't being talked about enough. One, he made great use of the innovative public financing laws in New York
Yeah,
that
yeah,
unfortunately are not available a lot of other places. But the other thing that doesn't get remarked on nearly enough is he built an organization of 50,000 volunteers. Let me say that again, 50,000 volunteers, primarily young people, and they knocked on well over 1 million doors. And they were amplifying those social media posts to all their friends, and they were talking to all their friends. And for what I think is the very first time in any New York election ever, voters under 45 equaled voters over 45. So he dramatically expanded the electorate. So I would say the creative use of social media combined with organizing a massive field operation of volunteers, particularly young volunteers, it is in that interplay that we get something worth replicating. And social media by itself, I mean, again, I go back, it's a tool and it's part of your marketing of your message. But if your whole election campaign is based on marketing and no organizing, the Democrats, particularly on the presidential races and the Senate races for the last 10 years, their view is all persuasion is done by advertising, digital or television. And so the field operation, usually paid canvassers who don't live in the neighborhood, knock on doors, They are paid by the number of doors they knock on, number of IDs they do. So, of course, they're going to go fast to maximize revenue. And they knock on a door and they say, "Who are you for?" If someone says, "I'm uncertain, I'm unclear," they say, "Thank you very much," and mark them down as uncertain and move on. No engagement. No, why should you care? What we know about the 24 election, we know that 17 million voters who voted for Biden didn't vote at all, didn't cast a ballot. They didn't vote for Trump. They stayed home. Now, we don't know why they stayed home. We can make some guesses because no one was talking to them, and still no one's talking to them. So we don't know what was up.
Well, it's a combination of no one was talking to them and a candidate who was not the world's greatest candidate until Biden dropped out. And then after Biden dropped out, it still wasn't the world's greatest candidate. So it's one part field, one part messaging, but one big part a
Right?
compelling candidate.
Candidate. And I'd also say the problem that Harris had is actually the strategic trap that those of us opposing Trump are in. So Harris became the candidate of the status quo, and the status quo isn't working for tens of millions of Americans. Our challenge in opposing the destructiveness of Trump is that we have to defend what he's attacking, or at least we have to fight against his attacks, but we can't be boxed into being the defenders of the status quo. So it is not enough to say save Medicaid. We've got to talk about how you get health care that is good and affordable, available and close to every American. It's not enough to say we defend academic freedom and free speech. We've got to talk about how we have to have a higher education system that is accessible and affordable for everyone who wants to go to it. So our dilemma right now is as he attacks everywhere and we defend everywhere, we get identified with defending the status quo, and that will not work. And the Mamdani was clearly the change candidate, and
Right.
that's what got him to change the electorate and win.
And of course, the other problem at this point is the Democratic Party, such as it is split several different ways. And you've got APAC and the crypto guys spending fortunes to make sure that progressives like Mamdani and other progressives don't end up being the nominee. You've got this fight on the Democratic National Committee over whether the DNC or anybody in an office on the DNC has any business, you know, wading into fights over challenging incumbents. And you don't have anything like a strategic consensus of message, technique, field, candidate. So is that just a matter of coming up with more candidates around the country who are like Mamdani, who can combine message, excitement, field operation, and technique? Uh, let me just I have a coda to that, but let me just leave it at that. What how do how do we overcome these schisms so that the
Right.
candidates who can combine these necessary ingredients are the ones who are the nominees?
So I think we have to start with the recognition of two things. One, the Democratic Party is a hollow shell. It is primarily about moving money and consultants and trying to dictate which consultants the campaigns use. But it's not a party. It can't deliver votes. Its leaders aren't held accountable by anybody. The people it elect aren't held accountable by their voters. The second tragedy of the Democratic Party is that for the last 40 some years, it has been enthralled with elites. Now, our elites are, include some university presidents and some charming actors and a few sports players, but they're still elites and there's still an awful lot of hedge fund managers and tech billionaires who have been in the elite of the Democratic Party and who the Democratic Party has pandered to. I don't see either of those changing. And so I think the renewal will have to come from candidates and insurgent organizations all over the country. And I do believe we're going to see, just as nobody outside of New York City had heard of Mamdani, before his primary win, I think we're going to see a new wave of leaders emerging, and we don't know who they are. They might be a city councilwoman in Iowa. They might be a first-time candidate in North Carolina. We don't know who they're going to be, but I believe they're going to come forward. The organization Run for Something, which targets young people, has seen a huge increase in the number of young people stepping forward and saying, we want to run. And I think those are our future leaders. I'm 78 years old, and I firmly believe that people as old as I should offer whatever wisdom, all the mistakes that we've made, and whatever support we can. And we should be largely getting off the stage and encouraging a new generation of leaders to emerge. I think the Democratic Party is a gerontocracy that is ridiculous. And how they can possibly look at themselves in the mirror through all those wrinkles and stay in power is just beyond me.
Let me quibble with that in one respect. What you said is certainly true. There are too many Democrats clinging to office who are too old. On the other hand, a lot of the coverage of the supposed generational shift leaves out message and ideology. And you can be a 35-year-old in bed with hedge fund guys
Right.
and be
Absolutely.
and be the wrong kind of 35-year-old. And what was great about Mamdani was not just that, he was 33 and that he got 50 million volunteers and dramatically increased the youth vote, but that he did it with a compelling message that spoke to ordinary people. And he did it in part thanks to New York's matching system, but not exclusively. I mean, he raised a lot of small money that would have been important even without the matching system. So I kind of wince at some of the punditry that treats it as just generational.
No, no, I think that's absolutely fair. Absolutely fair. Um, and it's going to be, I think over the next 4 years, we're going to see two kinds of candidates emerge and be successful in the Democratic Party. And it's not going to be so much right versus left, center versus left. It's going to be candidates who have an authentic identity as a change candidate
Yeah.
and address the issues that people really care about. And then it's going to be candidates who emerge as the anti-chaos candidates
Huh. Huh.
who also have a message that connects with people's day-to-day concerns. And they'll be described by the punditry as left-wing and centrist. But I think the successful ones will actually have the same basic agenda that they're talking to voters about. They'll just position themselves very differently. I'm thinking about Spamberger in Virginia. I think her program will be very much about pocketbook issues, but her sort of identity and persona will be I'm the anti-chaos. I'm on your side and I can bring stability, reliability, and you can trust me.
Well, and the centrists are trying to glom onto her as she's successful because she's a centrist.
Yeah. And I think again, the candidates that will be successful are the ones who address the real issues that are on voters' minds. And that certainly includes democracy and the due process, but it also concerns the high cost of living that is making it impossible for so many families to realize a future without incredible anxiety.
Now, you made the very apt point a few moments ago that there really is no Democratic Party, that it's a hollow shell, that it basically raises money, gives the money to consultants who then render bad advice and pocket big commissions. What's the interface between um, a better infrastructure that's not directly affiliated with the party, like Run for Something or Indivisible, and the kind of change candidacies that you're talking about? How do these two things map onto each other?
Well, I think they definitely do. I think the grassroots groups that are that have sprung up since Trump's election are, in addition to the unions, the only dynamic, organized constituencies working to elect Democrats. And I think that the change candidates, one, a number of them will emerge from these organizations. And two, I think they will work closely together to build grassroots field operations that resist the consultants and the marketing experts. You know, one of the things I really appreciate about activists today is that they seem, by and large, there's some exceptions, not to be making the mistakes that I made in the sort of 68, 69 period, where uh, we thought that protest and organizing was at odds with electoral politics. You know, in 1968, I'm ashamed to say that my position was vote in the street, vote with your feet, don't vote. I was 21, the voting age, excuse me, was 21. I never registered to vote. And the result is that Nixon won that election. It was one of the narrowest elections in our history. And, you know, we weren't wrong about Hubert Humphrey. He was a failed, unhappy candidate of the status quo who didn't break to the war with the war until the last days. And even then, it was a tepid break from the war. So we weren't wrong about him, but we were wrong about the damage that Nixon could do and what it meant to elect an insecure, egotistical uh, president who didn't have any regard for the Constitution.
Sounds very familiar.
Does sound very familiar, doesn't it? And I think there are people who sat out some elections that now wish they hadn't. But
Right.
I'd say by and large, I think today's activists understand that you have to compete for power in elections. You can't just protest from the outside.
Another issue, I think, is the relationship between professional organizers and amateur organizers. Um, there was a classic book when we were young, I think by James Hugh Wilson, called The Amateur Democrat, that looked at the New York Reform Democrats and the CDC in California, the IVI in Illinois, and quoted the old line that reformers are morning glories. Well, yeah, but sometimes insurgents win, and I guess a two-part question. So one of the stories you tell is about how mass fair share kind of came apart, and one of the reasons it came apart was that until Reagan pulled the plug on Vista volunteers, fair share had a lot of Vista volunteers in effect as paid organizers subsidized by the federal government. And the right in those years, the kind of counterpart of Project 2025, was very big on let's defund the left. And one of the ways of defunding the left was making sure that Vista volunteers could not work for fair share. How many Vista volunteers did you have approximately on your payroll?
So at our height, we had 40,
Wow.
and then we had an additional 30 paid organizers. So Fair Share was a very staff intensive organization. It also
Right.
had a paid door-to-door canvas. And so it reached a scale that was really impressive. 110,000 households paid us $15 or more as dues. And, you know, there were 3,000 active leaders in communities across Massachusetts, but it was very staff intensive. And, you know, organizing is a craft which needs to be learned, but we need literally 1 million organizers in these next 3 years. And we're not going to get that paid for by rich people or the government, certainly not the government.
No, and when money gets raised to go into a Democratic electoral campaign, the last place it goes into is charity organizing or staff organizing. It goes to paid consultants and TV ads and just,
And you know, and what people don't talk about, Bob, is I haven't been in a campaign on the inside recently, so I don't know that this is still true. But if you went back 20 years ago, campaign managers in the Democratic Party got a percentage of the advertising buy.
oh, they still do.
And so you have a complete self-interest in
Status
advertising
quo.
rather than field, which I think is just profoundly corrupt and corrupting. But what we have to do is we have to find ways to quickly train our volunteers, train the people who are coming to the protests, train the people who are in the phone banks to become organizers, to understand how to go and recruit new people, talk to them, how to structure groups. You know, if it can be in Indivisible, it can be in the Third Act, it can be in Union, or you can start your own group. But we need people in groups. You know, there's this wonderful woman at Harvard, Erica Chenoweth, who has been studying, um, protest movements and resistance to autocrats around the world. And she's come up with the fact that sort of a precondition for resisting autocracy is 3.5% of the population has to be involved. Well, now we've got a lot of people thinking if we just get 3.5% of the population to protest, that's the end of Trump, which is not. And so, what we have to convince people is we've got to build political power. And the only way we build political power is through building popular, small d democratic organization everywhere with every constituency. And so we need to be organizing farmers. We need to be organizing veterans. We need to be organizing scientists who are seeing the destruction of the scientific infrastructure. We need to be organizing students and alums. We need to be organizing around every single issue. But we also have to be organizing around a change agenda as well as a resist Trump agenda.
Let's talk a little bit about unions. So back in the day, the sector that did more organizing than anybody else was unions, because in order to build a union, you had to go out and organize people and get them to sign union cards. And with the weakening of the labor movement, there are fewer paid organizers, and there are fewer working class people who are acculturated to have the sensibility, the class sensibility of a union, where you understand that um, there's a struggle between capital and labor, and it's not just pointy-headed Harvard intellectuals who are my enemy, but it's the guy who's the boss in the boardroom. And with the dwindling of union representation, more and more of the working class is just easy pickings for the cultural right and the economic right. So I guess my question is, if you take the Mondani campaign, which is really interesting in this regard, because a lot of the unions that used to be very much involved with Working Families Party, which is another part of the story, um, were pressured by Cuomo when he was governor to disaffiliate from Working Families. Now you've got Working Families, of course, very strongly backing Hamdani, and you've also got most of the unions, with one big exception, who left in 2017, 2018, coming back into the Working Families Party. I guess my question is, to what extent, even though the labor movement is a shadow of its former self, um, are unions a source both of paid organizers with this broader agenda of the sort that you talk about, and also just rank and file union members being part of that army of door knockers, both around issues and during elections? We've seen it a little bit with Unite Here.
Unite here is the
In
best
2020,
example.
we saw it in Vegas, we saw it in Philly, but those were one-offs. Those are very unusual locals, and we haven't seen enough of it, in my view, anyway. Do you think there's going to be more of it? Can we count on more of it going forward?
I really don't know. I'd like to think so. And I'd also like to think that there would be aggressive union organizing, though this political environment is so hostile to unions. I mean, you've got the irony, I guess it's true of fascist movements in general. You've got the irony of the political party in charge saying it supports the working class and at the same time destroying them and destroying unions. The thing that I'm still trying to grapple with, which, Bob, you might have a better perspective than I do. If you look in Europe, there's been a right wing swing in Europe among unionized members, right? Because our hope was unions teach solidarity, unions teach the conflict between capital and labor, unions focus people on the role that the wealthy elites play and promote social solidarity. And yet, in Europe, in response to immigration and some cultural appeals, um, many union members have swung to the right. And I have to admit that I don't fully understand this. I mean, because it sort of undermines my easy narrative of what's happened in the United States. Because my easy narrative is the Democratic Party, once the party of the common man, completely gave up, embraced globalism, did nothing to stop the hollowing out of city after city, state after state, area after area, was enthralled to the elites. The economy, as we all know, meant that working people got no gains, costs, and so it is not surprising, my easy narrative goes, that they were open to be preyed on by a
Yeah.
right-wing demagogue. So, but Europe sort of causes me to think I'm not sure I understand all the factors here. Um,
Well, based on my own work on Europe, I'll give you three different responses that are all reinforcing, that all cut in the same direction. So, if you're a Swedish worker, a trade unionist, and you've always voted for the Social Democrats, and you vote for the Social Democrats, and it's not that they have joined the upper class, it's that in the face of globalization, they're powerless to prevent some of these same trends from afflicting Sweden. And there's a lot of job loss for skilled factory workers. And well, if my friends in the Social Democratic Party aren't able to prevent this, I might as well vote for the conservatives and vote myself a tax cut. So that's one element. These small countries that traditionally voted for Social Democrats, they were swept along into these globalization patterns that they couldn't prevent. And then, of course, automation is part of the story. And the combination of automation and globalization does cost a lot of factory jobs. And then immigration adds to the problem. And I think um, the Swedish Social Democrats, the Danish Social Democrats were punished for being virtuous, the or compassionate. I mean, the last time I was in Sweden on a reporting trip would have been about 2017. At that point, the Social Democrats had the government, and somebody said to me, "Gee, there's a immigrants' rights rally tomorrow. If you're not too jet lagged, you should go listen to it." So I went, and the keynote speaker was the prime minister. I repeat, the keynote speaker at the immigrant rights rally was the prime minister, a wonderful man named Stefan Löfven. Guess what happened to him in the next election,
right, right.
right? And the right-wing parties in Sweden have done a brilliant job of splitting the constituencies for the Swedish welfare state. Their slogan is, if you depend on welfare, you should vote for the Social Democrats. If you work for a living, you should vote for us. So the right is very adept at destroying solidarity. So I think it's one part immigration. And of course, the difference between Sweden and Denmark is that the Social Democrats have stayed in power in Denmark by emulating the right when it comes to immigration. We are for the welfare state, but we're only for the welfare state for Danes. And if you're an immigrant, so they sound almost like Trump. You're not going to qualify. We're not going to give you benefits. And so they keep getting elected. I'm oversimplifying, but I
Right,
think
right.
that's the basic story. So it isn't that the labor movement sold out. It's that the globalization invented on Wall Street and disseminated by Clinton and God help me, Obama, just overwhelmed these social contracts in these other democratic countries. It's
And so,
another American export that we could have
right.
done without.
And so again, I go back to we need a change agenda that realistically addresses the problems of people's lives.
Yep.
And, we're probably not able, I wouldn't say probably, we are not able to get back the jobs that we lost. So we have to figure out how we create an economy that works for the people who've been left
Yeah.
behind and works for all the young people. And we're only going to get that, as you write all the time, if we take on the hedge fund managers and the bankers and the tech billionaires and are willing to fight with them. One of the things I also don't understand is how can you have hundreds of millions of dollars and be upset when there's a 1% tax increase on those hundreds of millions of dollars? This is a psychology of greed and power that I find baffling. I mean, these are educated people, these are smart people, and yet they will resist any tax increase and any diminution of their power. And so that's where the fight has to be, against the extremely, insanely rich and for a redistributive economy that works for all.
Yeah, and I think one of the messaging mistakes that our side has made is to talk about equality as a frame or as an issue. The issue is not equality. That sounds like we're for, redistributing money to the undeserving poor.
Right,
The
right,
issue is I can't afford to live. And if you frame it that way, and we've given $4 trillion of tax cuts to billionaires so that you lose your medical coverage, and we really could make it possible as we lose these factory jobs for anybody in the human services taking care of old people, young people, sick people to make at least $40,000 a year. We could do that. This is what annoys me about Ezra Klein. It's not that we don't have an economy of abundance, it's that the wrong people get
right.
to tap the abundance.
It's a
And
question of distribution. And I always thought and still think that Fair Share was a brilliant name and our pitch really
brilliant.
worked, right? Because we said our whole pitch to white working class families was very simple. You have always done what you were asked to do. You have paid your taxes, you've obeyed the laws, you've worked hard, you've served in the military, and you don't get your fair share. Whereas the elites get more than their fair share and refuse to pay their fair share. And
Well,
again, I think that's the framing that we need today.
and as you know, that phrase has such resonance
Right.
that when we finally got a millionaire's tax bracket, it was called the fair share
Fair
tax.
share. Right.
I'm
Right.
sure that gave you a lot of pleasure.
No, enormous, enormous. And some of the organizers who had been in Mass Fair Share, like Lou Finfer, were critical in that campaign as well.
Yeah,
And I'd love to see fair shares all around
right,
the country.
right.
But the only way we get that kind of change agenda, fair share agenda, is if we build political power and not just mobilize. And
You know,
that's what we
Mike,
have to keep saying.
Michael, what's really interesting is that we're contradicting ourselves a little bit in a very instructive way. Um, we were both saying, I think, in different words, that charismatic candidates who have the right message, who are good at articulating the message, who are good at motivating young people to go out and knock on doors, are a big part of the secret sauce. And yet, when Fair Share was at the peak of its power, uh, it was not involved in electoral politics.
Right.
You've written in your book that this was a mistake. It probably should have been. This was a wasting resource. On the other hand, Fair Share did very, very well at mobilizing people around economic pocketbook issues that affected working class lives,
And
utility
and, and
costs and insurance costs and you name it. So maybe with the right set of issues and the right set of strategies and the right organizers, which is assuming a lot, you can do it even without charismatic candidates.
I think you can, but the mistake that we made at Fair Share was we always intended to eventually get into the electoral arena.
Ah,
But we found a really hard time doing that because we had inculcated in so many of our leaders and members that the electoral game was rigged against them, as it was, and that it was a dirty game, as it was. And so they were very reluctant to get into it. I think had we not hit the financial problems that we hit and just outgrown my ability to manage the organization, I think we would have made that transition. And you saw it in Boston because it was Boston Fair Share that elected the populist Ray Flynn, when he
Well,
got entrenched.
you also saw it with our colleague and friend Miles Rappaport, who
Yep.
took the fair share formula to Connecticut and figured out how to make it both community and electoral, and basically took over state government in Connecticut and turned Connecticut into a reliably blue state. So, taken to scale, that strategy can work.
So I think to go back to what you were saying, I think charismatic leaders, candidates with the right message can accelerate that process, but it's not dependent on them if you have organizers who will take up the issues. I mean, the cost of electricity is about to soar. That was one of our key organizing issues for Fair Share. Services are about to decline. Healthcare is going to deteriorate.
Right.
Hospitals are going to close. Students are going to have to leave universities, on and on and on. There's not a paucity of organizing opportunities. There is, unfortunately, a paucity of organizers. And to go back to our statement before, our discussion before, I don't think we can wait for trained paid organizers. I
Right.
think we have to figure out how to get thousands, tens of thousands of volunteers who are going to protests to become organizers in their own community.
Well, the book is well timed. The book is called The Hard Work of Hope. People should read it, and it's been a pleasure talking with Michael Ansara.
Bob, thank you so much.
My pleasure.